Right, well, what I'm interested in doing is applying a little bit of graphite powder to this mechanism plate to get into the surface between the blade actuating ring and the mechanism plate itself. And the idea of that is that that will lubricate those surfaces, but unlike using a liquid like an oil or a grease, it won't go sticky over time. I'm just working that in. Knock out the loose stuff and blow any excess out. That's all that's required. If I find my good tweezers, no, they're hiding, they're going to be seen again. We'll carry on with these third best tweezers. So, I set the blade actuating ring in the position against the post, against the where the main drive cam will run. This will put the blades in the fully open position. Now I can lay the blades in place. The second blade having the steep cutout at the back of the blade, as I mentioned. You can see it clears that hole there. If you don't put the blades back in the right order and you have one of the other blades in that position, you'll find that the shutter won't run and the blade will get damaged. And our sixth blade, the cover blade, covers the first blade. I've moved my blade actuator ring very slightly there so the tips of the blades are not extending out beyond the edges of the plate, because now I need to get my case back over that. Now fitting the case back over that, there's a hole in the back of the case. It's a square hole and we're going to put it over a round peg. And holding these together with between finger and thumb, I can pick up one of the 3 screws that hold the shutter case and the mechanism plate together and put it into position. I'll check now that the blades do swing into place. They do, they're working correctly. And I can put my other 2 screws in the back of the case. I noticed that when I put that first screw in, the thread was reasonably tight. I can't think of a good reason why that should be, though it may well be that the thread had been slightly distorted. As I say, those screws, when I took the shutter apart, those screws were unusually tight. Things have been over tightened, then effectively the screws can be distorted and then they will not just run in as freely as they otherwise might. That's working nicely, and I want to put a tiny touch of molybdenum paste on that detent spring and on two spots on the blade actuating ring that get picked up by the main drive cam. I'll check the action again. Well, that certainly modified the feel of that action quite a lot. The detent still works, but where there's the drag that I felt, the friction I felt as it moved is depleted. That's just about gone. That's good. Now I want to install that spring, the B lever, and the B lever return spring. That takes some manipulating getting that small spring in, so I want my good plier tweezers, so I'm going to go and find those. Alright, are we fully zoomed in? We are indeed. Okay, so I need to start with this spring. Drop it into position. Now I've got to hold a toothpick over that post there, so that the spring can't get away as I lift the end of the spring up and hook it behind the other lever. No. That's it. That spring is hooked behind the stud here and the lever here. That's the difficult one. It's an easy spring to lose too. It'll run away across the room as quick as look at you. So holding back this lever, I'm going to move the blade actuating ring into the open position and fit the B lever in place. Here's the B lever sitting in position. Now I have to get the return spring for the B lever in place. And this is awkward because it doesn't really fit the space. I want to get that screw started. That's good. Then I can pull that spring round into position because it doesn't want to go. Then drop that screw down, check that that pivots freely. It does. Alright, so the B lever is now being returned by that spring. The other end of the spring is bearing on this lever. This lever is where I'll just lift up the B lever, take the blade back to the closed position. This lever here, its job is to hold the shutter fully closed when you release the shutter until the self timer has run down and pulled that latch back out of the way. Well, those components are in. I'll just check that screw on that post, that's good. Next I'll need to put in my flash sync componentry. It's these components. The return spring and the two screws that hold it all together. So I need to clean those components before I install them. Again, using naphtha. These components are very clean. Usually they are fairly clean anyway, these components. They're not prone to a great deal of contamination. These ones are particularly clean. This lever latches the shutter, latches the main drive cam into the cocked position when you cock the shutter. And it's important that it's not sticky. If it's contaminated with oil, you often get a film of oil down here between the arm and the bracket itself, and that can make it sticky, in which case typically you can release the shutter, but the shutter won't stay cocked. This is only pulled back into the cocked position by the action of a very fine spring. If it's sticky with grease or oil or dust or corrosion, it'll fail to pull down into place, and so the shutter won't cock correctly. This is our flash contact. Those components look good. So I start with this. This is the pallet wheel. It controls the rate at which the geared sector gear here and arm can move at when released, which controls the delay between the time the flash contacts make when set to the M, which is the flash bulb setting, before the shutter actually fires. With electronic flash, the flash is triggered when the shutter blades are fully open. With bulb flash, the flash is triggered before all this happens, and that's because bulbs take a certain amount of time to start burning to peak brilliance. So if you triggered them at the moment the blades were fully open, unless you were running a very slow shutter speed, you would lose half the benefit of your bulb flash. Now I'll just hook this spring into place. Now I did apply some molybdenum to that, but I didn't tell you I was doing it. That's right at the tip where that lever latches. In the cocked position it sits like this. As soon as the shutter starts to move, that timer runs. Used a slight amount of molybdenum there to lubricate this. That spring's sticking out at a very enthusiastic angle. It'll be okay though. That lever sits in place there. The flash contact sits on top of that lever and is actuated by it. I'll pull this into the cocked position. And this plate and its arm can go on there. A single screw at this end. At the other end we have the spring that swings this arm into position. And that's retained with the screw there. Be careful that the spring sits round the shoulder on that screw and is not trapped underneath the shoulder. Just checking that it moves freely. That spring can be lifted across behind that arm, and there's a little notch in the back of the arm that it rests in. Now that arm is sprung loaded. Just checking if I'm still in the picture. I am. There you go. That arm is sprung loaded, and you can see at this point on the arm, that's where it catches and holds the main drive cam in the latched position. Here we have the shutter release arm. I'll put a tiny smear of molybdenum on the shaft of that where it runs, its pivot point. That drops into the case here. Its return spring, the tail of its return spring here, needs to be carried right over the top of that screw, and it tucks down underneath that mechanism plate, that little plate there. It's not quite sitting down there. Let's give that a little... That's it. Wasn't quite dropped into place, now it is. So you can see when you press the shutter release, it lifts this arm, which pulls the other end of the arm away from the main drive cam, allowing the drive cam to rotate and open and close the shutter blades. So we have our main drive cam and its spring. I'm just looking at the condition of the spring. Over time these springs lose tension. When they were new, if you take the bent end as being at 12, the little upright peg here bent up would have been at roughly the 2 o'clock position. This one, it's somewhere between the 2 and 3 o'clock position. More commonly you will find that this peg, this raised bit here, is somewhere between the 3 and 4 o'clock position. If it's anything more than 4 o'clock, if it's closer to between 4 and 5 o'clock, the spring will probably lack sufficient tension to work except in a freshly serviced shutter. So in other words, it won't be reliable in the long term. These springs used to be replaced as a matter of course during a shutter service, back when these cameras were comparatively current, in their first 10 or 15 years of life, you might say. The springs are no longer available, haven't been available for a long time, and so it's a case of finding a better spring to use if I strike a camera that has a spring that's too worn or too tired to be useful. At times repairers have tried to deal with this problem by various methods. One of them is to just bend the tab up a bit further around, bending a bit more of the spring up if you like, so that it's effectively under more tension to start off with. And that does work to a certain extent. You have to be, if you carry it to extremes, you'll find that you have trouble getting the shutter to cock. It'll certainly cause the spring to be under more stress when it's in the cocked position. And in some cases I have found that where this has been done, the bent up tab on the end of the spring has been left too long. And where it's been left too long, it's stuck through the fixing hole in the bottom of the main drive cam and actually dragged on the mechanism plate. And in those cases you could see a groove cut into the aluminium mechanism plate by the end of the spring, which of course was stopping the mechanism from running as quickly as it should have done, and which sort of defeated the purpose of stiffening up the spring. So if you're tempted to modify the spring to improve its tension, don't overdo it, is what I would say. I can see that this video camera is telling me that the battery is tired, so I'll stop at this point. I'll clean up my drive cam and my spring, again with a bit of naphtha. Then I'll lubricate the drive cam and the spring with a little bit of molybdenum paste, and then put them back in place. These components are quite clean as well. Whoever assembled the shutter certainly didn't overdo it with lubricant, which is good. It's good. Lubricant is only useful when it's on the surfaces that can benefit from it, and very often it creates a nuisance if it's in other places. I put a tiny smear of molybdenum on the inside of that spring. I'm not really convinced it makes an awful lot of difference. Now I've got to get the spring fitted. The little tab on the bottom of the spring has to fit in the hole in the arm. And I might have to hold that spring down in place while I pull it into position, since it's wanting to pop out. That seems better. That's happy. So, this surface on that lever, I'll just run a bit of molybdenum paste across there. That's in the cocked position. If I cock the main drive spring, it latches into place. If I push the shutter release, the shutter fires. So that's all working correctly. That shutter, the next stage for the shutter is to install the retard gear train and the delay action or self timer. Oh, I can put these components back on first, I suppose. This is the setting ring for the delay timer, and it also sets the flash sync speed, and this is the retainer. That's also the latch, the catch that you have to hold in order to change the setting for this. Let me just clean these components. These parts only require a very cursory clean. They're very clean. There wasn't an awful lot wrong with this shutter, considering that it's probably either never been serviced or hasn't been serviced in the last 3 or 4 decades. I'd say that's a pretty remarkable achievement. I'll put touch of molybdenum on that ridged surface here so that the arm will release from it smoothly, and the spring in the shutter case, which is fairly well hidden in here, there's a little detent spring that this pin runs against. I was just making sure that that had a touch of molybdenum on it too. Now fitting that ring in place with its pin here on the correct side of that spring, and the retainer only goes on in one position. You might need to press in the button here to allow this to drop into place. There are 3 screws retaining this in place. Get all 3 screws in position, then tighten them up. That way you're not fighting against anything. That's good. I've got a front section taken from a Reflex S which I use as a shutter mount to hold this while I'm working on it. I'll find that.